So, before I get into the interview portion with my guests, I love just reading back to them something that I found that they've posted online. And for you, I went to your Instagram and I found this post. It is an excerpt from your book, We Too: How the Church Can Respond Redemptively to the Sexual Abuse Crisis. And I'm going to read this quote for our listeners, and then I just want you to tell us more about that. It says this: sexual abuse and our inept response to it is an unspoken and seldom articulated crisis within the evangelical church. In the sunset of the attractional church model, we have succeeded in wooing many through our front doors with relevant teaching, powerful concert like worship, a myriad of family friendly programs with a charismatic celebrity pastor at the helm. Yet, our painful, untold story lies in the crowd of broken people flooding through our back doors, many of them people who have been victimized. Can you tell us a little bit about what prompted you to share this post?
Yeah, so it definitely has to do with this idea of advocacy for those who have been victimized by sexual abuse, but I also have a heart for those who have experienced spousal abuse and of late spiritual abuse as well. We ask the question, why are people leaving our churches? And honestly, my husband and I are not leavers, but we were in a church for 23 years, and just recently, within the past couple months, we left a church that had this kind of culture. And so, and we did not take that lightly, but I'm looking at it and thinking, why is that? And I think part of that has to do with the lack of shepherding that's happening. And I don't want to put all the pressure on one man or one woman as a pastor. I think we are all called to be pastors to one another and to shepherd one another and to help each other grow. But for me, I didn't feel shepherded in my story almost my entire life. And as a sexual abuse survivor, I often say I can count on one hand over the 20 something years that I've been in church. It's been probably longer than that, actually, that I've heard a sermon about sexual abuse. And several of those under the five were me preaching them. So it's just, I think there's a lot of people out there that feel like they're disconnected from church because they feel like their story is unusual, or it just is like not nice to talk about it in church.
Can you tell us a little bit about your personal story growing up and your childhood, just so people who may be listening that are wondering what you may know, this Christian author with over 50 books, about their pain. Would you walk us through a little bit about your own personal story?
Yeah, there's this thing called the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, and I pretty much I think I've experienced all of them. So, not as a badge of honor, but I definitely was in a home of multiple divorces, drug abuse, a lot of neglect. Sexual abuse happened outside of the home, but it was not noticed because of the other things going on in my home. Death of a parent. The sexual abuse occurred at 5 when I was at a babysitter's house, and these older teenage boys would come and take me out, and the babysitter knew what they were doing, but just pushed me outside to anyway. And that occurred for a whole year. And thankfully, we moved by the end of my kindergarten year, so I was away from those terrible boys, but I did feel like from that point on, I had some sort of moniker on my forehead that said, "Come get me." And so I spent most of my childhood just running and running and running away from people trying to steal from me. And, and then having a parent die and multiple divorces and neglect and all of that, unstable home, very unsafe place, you can imagine what kind of wounds and trauma that brings up in a child. And so, in some ways, because of that trauma, that's what caused me to reach heavenward and to find Jesus at 15, because I was so desperately suicidal and broken and alone, and I had nowhere else to go. And thankfully, in that void, Young Life stepped in, and I started hearing the gospel for the first time.
I want to first just say I'm so sorry for what you've experienced. And I honestly, I have tears in my eyes, just hearing you share that. And I am hopeful because I hear you saying like, "Hey, in my story, in all this pain, young life stepped up," right? And yet there are so many people, and you allude to this in the post that I shared, who have like almost an opposite experience with the church, right? Where they think I've had I teach college, so I have so many students, and I've heard this story countless times at this point of women who think that they're in a safe group with people at their church, and they share their story and they feel condemned, or they're told, well, you shouldn't have been there. It's, they're re-victimized again by sharing their story. What advice would you give to a listener right now who maybe that is not their experience of trauma or sexual abuse, but they want to be a better listener when somebody shares their story with them? How would you advise them to handle those types of conversations?
I think we're trained to feel like we're supposed to have answers, but I would love to train people in the art of holy curiosity, of having a listener posture, and just not without not with a curiosity of like a gossipy curiosity of like, tell me that story, but a curiosity of tell me that story and how it affected you. And then, and I'll tell you a quick story how that affected me once. I was in South Africa at the Lausanne Congress of World Evangelization, and I shared my story at a small group at our little table that I was at. And at the very end of the conference, this man came up to me who was at my table. He was South African, but there were people from all over the world at my table. And he got on his knees. He heard my story. He got on his knees and he was weeping. And he said, "I'm sorry for what all those men have done to you. I apologize." And what that showed me first was he heard my story. And second, that he empathized. And third, that he had that prayer like Nehemiah, where he identified with the sins that were committed against me, which was such a powerful experience. And so I think that can be part of a really powerful interaction that you can gift a friend who's struggling.
That is real. Oh man, I was just reading a book and I'm trying to remember which one it was, where they were talking about how, of course, in the West, we hear sin and we tend to think only individually, but in the biblical culture, you would hear sin and you would always think collectively. So that was really interesting that he was apologizing on the collective. And there's just, I think, a message in that for Christians today, right? And yet sometimes it seems like, I don't know, what would you say to somebody who is saying, well, let's just not focus on these stories, or let's not focus on the dark side because there's so much good and I don't want people to get lost, right? In the good that the church is doing because they hear these stories.
Okay, are you ready for the preacher to come out of me? Okay, I would say that then church then becomes a false reality, and church becomes about creating what are called Potemkin villages, which was something that happened in a long, long time ago, where this czar came and to this village in Russia, and they didn't want him to think that the village was ugly, so they created these facades. And he went through and saw how pretty this town was, but if you walked through the door of the town, there was just mud on the other side. And I think we need to remember that Jesus, when he interacted with people, he went right to the root of their story. And he was not afraid of hearing it, nor was he shocked by it. He welcomed those stories. And I think that the thing that I say to audiences all the time is an untold story never heals. But if we create environments where we can't tell those stories, we are going to be shutting down people who actually are our tutors to discipleship. Those of us who have been broken by life and have been raked over the coals and have been abandoned and harmed and all those things, we are actually the tutors to the body of Christ because we understand our lack. Our brokenness becomes that place where the strength of God can shine. Whereas people that have it all together just stiff arm God and they're not going to grow. And so when we push away people who are weak or who have problems, we're pushing away discipleship.